So my name's Alex. I'm actually an anaesthetics and intensive care trainee doctor based here in Oxford. I say based here in Oxford. I haven't worked here for over a year. I've been working on a European Space Agency funded project to work out how we can eventually go to Mars safely and possibly return as well. I'll leave the note possibly. Humble beginnings. I grew up in the north of England. I'm only a northerner, a simpleton. And with that, I apply a simple approach to life. Global health lessons and the various countries I've been very privileged to work in. Yesterday, I turned 30, and in 30 years, I've lived, worked, and traveled not through 60, but 70 countries. And that's in medicine, in global health, as a medical student, flying around here, there, and everywhere. But it's really from being born to dual heritage. My father's Indian, my mother's English. And with that, you have a dual perspective on life. And that's what's driven me through life to look at things from two angles, to look at things from, a humble upbringing in the north of England through to growing up a little bit in India as well. And it really changes your perception of how you view yourself, how you view others. It's good memory. It's a distant memory now. But there I was at the John Radcliffe, dressed in very warm clothing, setting off to be an Antarctic astronaut, essentially, to work out what we would need to go to Mars. And these travels, these trips around the world, I mean, essentially, it doesn't come without risk. And this was Happy New Year to me, and advice to the audience: don't spend your New Year's Day in a decompression chamber in Argentina. It's not fun, although you can make it fun. So I introduced the world's most expensive photograph, $2.5 billion. And this got me thinking down there in the Antarctic winter. You sat there just in the monotonous, sensory deprived state, and there you are, thinking, $2.5 billion. How on earth, what would I do if I had that money? And I think back to the lessons in global health, in malaria and other things, and I think, well, I could, solve one of the world's problems with that. And I wrote an interesting article in the New York Times, which drove some controversy. And what it drove, the point of the article was really to say, and again, taking a simple approach, malaria versus Mars, malaria or Mars, who do we pay this money to if we have this money? And arguably, it's a decision that only lies within the policymakers and in your own brains. I'm not here to tell you otherwise. And on these trips around, I ran into Sir Ranulph Fiennes. I set up some science for him for his recent expedition. I was honoured to actually be invited to be his doctor too. And I got to take blood from him for the science. And I'm shaking now on television, going towards him, and he's shaking to go away from me. And I'm not even looking at him as I'm taking his blood. It's most amazing, the greatest catch ever. But Rand taught me something interesting, something important, and that was we have exploration inside us. And this is a timeless idea I'd like to introduce to you. It's exploration. We have it in us, and we have to do it. And that's what he does. That's the way he lives, and that's the way I've begun to live as well now. It's taken me all around the world, from standing on a tank turret, pointing over towards Syria, through to motorbiking and various other bits and bobs, but through extreme physiology and psychology. My love for animals, their love for me. Conservation, if that's what you call it. And snake catching. I went to go and learn how to catch venomous snakes. And it's quite difficult, because actually this type of snake can bite through its own lower jaw into your fingers when you're holding it. And as you can see by the child's face, who's learning to catch snakes to make a living in India, it's not much fun. Neglected tropical diseases. So snake bite is one of the things I've worked in around the world, and it's one of these diseases that you just don't want, but is associated with poverty. You may not actually have a choice, and a lot of the world's population don't. Thomas Malthus brings about an interesting concept to me, supply versus demand, that the increase of population is necessarily limited by the means of subsistence. So anti-venom, and I bring some with me today, somewhere. How much for, anyone wants any? Anti-venom? How much for one of these in your local village in Africa? How much in Papua New Guinea? This is what you need if you get bitten by a snake. And if I say I've put a saw-scale viper of West Africa under one of your seats, how much now? It's eBay bidding, isn't it? So this is one of the problems, but don't worry, it's expired, so it's useless anyway, and don't be conned. It's actually not for saw-scale vipers of West Africa, it's for a completely different species. These are the problems you're beginning to learn around the world. So going on to malaria, you can look at all the statistics and they'll, deaths, people affected, where are we going with it all? But actually, it's down to the medication, and it's the same with the antivenom. I bring Malaria, £2.10 per tablet from GlaxoSmithKline. Fortunately, they've just lost their patent, so this will be very, very cheap in a few months. But until then, if you're part of the bottom billion on the planet, you're living off $1.25 or less per day, per month, per year, whatever your family can bring in when it's suffering from malaria. And I want to introduce a lesson to you. The lesson is something taught to me by an old professor. And the professor said when he was teaching about malaria in West Africa on a scheme, on a fund, on a grant, he gave a brilliant presentation. And he gave a presentation with, standard transported equipment around village to village. At the end of one village talk, after putting this great presentation up on malaria, an elder came up to him in the village and said, "That's great, really good talk." He said, "Oh, thank you, But really, we don't have," and the old man said, "we don't have mosquitoes that big here." So I adapt these international lessons. The world is a global classroom to me. It's a collaborative classroom. And that took me to the Arctic, and I fell in love, love at first sight. It's absolutely magnificent. And if any of you are ever wondering, it's Shackleton's famous fabled advertisement. No one knows whether it appeared or not. Bitter cold, long months of darkness, constant danger. And I draw your attention to safe return doubtful. Who doesn't want to go? So, who in the audience would like to go and spend a year in Antarctica? How many hands? Look at that. We'll see by the end of the talk. Scott went there, didn't come back. He made the bad decision about ponies versus dogs. Doesn't matter. What he went there for was to discover what lay at the uttermost end of the world, only to find when he stood there on the South Pole, to describe it, great God, this is an awful place. But he missed the point. The point of Antarctica is, it's all in the science, what lies beneath. And that's the real gem, that's the real wealth of Antarctica. That's why we're there. And Edward Wilson, the first doctor to the South Pole, a hero of mine, he hauled 14 kilograms of geological samples across the continent for scientific purpose, reason only. He died of exhaustion, of dehydration, of starvation from dragging those samples for science. And that's the blazing trail that expedition left there. So I took my job interview, and I don't know if anyone's ever seen these. These are Rorschach test cards. And they're ink blot patterns that are made just by pressing ink together. They're really interesting things in terms of what do you think when you see that? So, 53% of people will say, I see a bat or something else. I said in my interview for the job that I see what looks to me like a run-over cartoon cat. What do you see? I thought I'd lost the job, but the French are tricky, and they're tricky because at the top of the image, you'll see, as I pointed out to the French psychologist, Le Tour Eiffel. I got the job. And off I went to 18,000 kilometers through, traveling to this unpainted continent. What God, if there is a God, left white, perhaps purposely so. It's the seventh last continent. Perhaps he took rest on the last day. Who knows? But it's majestic, it's treacherous, and it'll betray you at the simplest step. It'll take your fingers, your legs, your life. Off I went to Middle Earth. Concordia Station, only one of 3 inland Antarctic stations that overwinter with a human team. And yes, it's wonderful going down there. The first iceberg. And yes, more icebergs and ice. Marvelous. Magnificent. Splendid. And I think the old saying goes, a real Englishman never travels without his umbrella. I think it must have pleased the French to no end. But this is where you land, 5 hours flight inland, over 1,000 kilometers in most directions from almost nothing. And that's where you are, the end of the world, the uttermost end of the world. And that's what it feels like. T.S. Eliot's wasteland, it's just nothing. And then you're out, you bundle, and there you are. Dr. Kumar, I presume, from the famous Livingston Morton meeting in Central Africa. That's what it feels like, mingling with the locals, French and Italians. Close your eyes, imagine. Close your eyes, imagine for a moment your doorstep, your front doorstep. This is it, 1,000 kilometers in most directions of nothingness. That's what you have to deal with. But it's truly remarkable. It's remarkable because it's what I called it was Planet Concordia. This is the closest you can come to living on another planet for these reasons. First, it's a place where science takes second place to survival, and I think that's an important point to note. But really, you've got altered daylight cycles. You've got 3 months of complete darkness. The sun doesn't rise. You've got the coldest temperatures in the world. How cold? Minus 80 degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit. You've got 9 months of complete isolation, so much so that perhaps if the Queen wanted to get you out and call up and say, come out, you can't get out. You're locked in. And then you've got no oxygen as well. You've got a complete lack of oxygen. So is it any wonder that the people who interviewed me to go there haven't actually spent a winter there themselves? Eek. So the number one rule of Penguin Club, you don't freeze, but you do freeze, and it's fun. And you end up wallowing like a hippopotamus in the Serengeti sun. But, you know, it's a serious job being the doctor down there because you know no one's going to come in or out. In 1960, Leonid Rogozov, a Russian, had to take out his own appendix under local anesthetic. He did it in a time less at some surgical registrars that I used to do anesthetics for, fumbling around, take their patient's appendix out. Important point. So 100 years ago, Scotsmen stood there. They may as well have been stood on Mars. That was what an undertaking, an epic undertaking they did. And here we are. And I listen to Frenchmen now, and one Frenchman once said, Jean-Paul Sartre, hell is people. And an interesting aspect for the Antarctic winter. I'm a good texter. I've got nieces I text with often. So you keep calm and carry on, don't you? It's just the point. My favourite photograph in polar history. This is Sir Ernest Shackleton's men stood waving off on Elephant Island. I stood here just 4 months ago. And it's incredible because they were waving off, not knowing if anyone would ever come back for them. Read the story. It's amazing. It wasn't so romantic when our last plane left. We just got a face full of ice. It was pretty much, you know, a face full of ice. Goodbye. And you get into this prehistoric, you know, 2001 Space Odyssey mindset as you start to go about your science. Geology, no geology, no rocks there. Glaciology, meteorology, and human sciences. And taking blood in minus 80 is an interesting thing. But you're looking to see how to stop astronauts' brains from going sour, going stale, turning off, switching off on that 9-month mission to Mars. And that's why it is a white Mars where we're living. How far is Mars? Yeah. Depends. 9 months with the current technology. If you're going to drive there, it's going to take you about 200 years. If Ryanair were to fly there from Stansted, 32 years, and they may, depending on the company, charge you for the use of the toilet per time. So seriously, can we go to Mars? Well, I put it down to 3 things. Will we? Can we? Should we? Can we? Radiation risk. Yes, there's a risk there. So is having a CAT scan in your local hospital. Money. Yes, we can afford it. We already have, in many ways, to do different things. Technology. Once it gets a little better. Should we? Should we risk human life as Scott did? At what cost does this human and financial loss take? But what gain? What technological advances will we make? And really, the point is, you know, should we go? And that's what I'll leave you to ponder over yourselves. Now, I deal with oxygen. I put 250 mils of oxygen into a patient per minute to keep their brain alive during surgery. Okay, so I think of it as a currency of life. Now, Dale, who is a friend at the South Pole who overwintered, gave me something interesting. He gave me a vial of the cleanest air on Earth. Now, this means nothing now, I mean, but in 200 years we could sell this for a lot, if anyone's interested. But it really makes you think, doesn't it, that the carbon content is going up so high. And with that, I move on to the next point, that the winter moves on. Your mind starts to switch off. You start to lose your old self. The light starts to fade, the stars come out. And you watch the sun go down, and there it goes, slowly, the last sunset. and it goes, and then it's gone. And you're there alone as a group, living, isolated, remote. And all there is a sunless sky. It's below the horizon at this time. And what are you left with? The stars start to come out. But then the monsters of the mind start to come out as well. And it's simple arithmetic, really. Extreme isolation and 3 months of darkness equals what? Who knows? We found out. The human mind isn't left to simmer, it's set to boil. So I took a Kinder Surprise down with me. How long could I go without breaking into it to find out? The whole winter, and there was a truck inside. It was brilliant. But you plummet down this rabbit hole, you know, Alice in Wonderland's rabbit hole, and there you go, down, down, down. It's a psychological marathon, but one of the world's greatest, most peculiar journeys. And there you are, there's no turning back. You want to get out, you can't. Tough. And that's what it is. 4 o'clock in the morning, staring at yourself back in the wall. That's when all your layers are stripped off, and that's when you dredge the ocean depths of your own mind. And the monsters come out to play, monsters of the mind. And the paranoia starts to set in about your confederates. Wilson! And what fun I had with my monsters. But this is one of the most peculiar journeys on Earth, and you can spend your time doing photography. I bring this to you now. I wasn't a photographer before I went down there, but it's magnificent. You stand beneath the diamond sky with one hand waving free, silhouetted by the sea, circled by circus sands, with all memory and fate driven deep beneath the waves. Let me forget about today until tomorrow. It was Bob Dylan that got me through that winter. And this was taken with a standard SLR camera. This too, and it's like living on a space station. The natural movement of the stars, the Milky Way, the Aurora Australis. And it just makes you think how small we are, how insignificant we are, and what is out there. Who knows? And you have extracurricular activities. You have the Guinness Book of Records to come for the world's coldest game of tennis, -65, that I may or may not have won. You have Wilson too, because Wilson once been stolen by someone. And you have to overcome all these problems, all these events. And my greatest achievement to life is getting people up on the roof. Not just anyone, but French, Italians, and one Russian. Up on the roof. Why? To celebrate Her Majesty the Queen. And I did. You had neighbors with astronauts. You know, some of the nearest people to you are astronauts on board the International Space Station. This is a different planet. This is, you know, somewhere so far removed from your day-to-day life back in the UK. And you sit and wait for the sun to come back. Time runs out. It just goes on. And you wait. And you wait a really long time. Take a shaving kit to Antarctica, because I didn't. And suddenly it happens. Back comes the sun, re-entry, and this is it. These are the photos. The first sunrise. And the color switches back on. Your neurons start to ignite. The withering that's happened is reignited. The arsenic is removed. And, you know, your mind starts to wake up again. It's like, what have I done? Where have I been? In a magical place, a magical kingdom. And then the first plane arrives, and with that, you know, everyone turns back into these Caribbean personalities from their really contorted, Gollum-esque people. And a Kiwi. Now, I saw, as we were unloading the first fruit from that plane, the Italian IT expert, he put a Kiwi in his pocket. I saw him. I looked, and I was doing exactly the same thing. But you come upside down outside the winter, and then that's it, bang. You're out, and that's good. And you drive a car around legal limits, speeds, around New Zealand to try and get back on it. But it doesn't come without sacrifice. I'm lucky to carry a sense of humor around, and so my family too. But the real lessons learned, and I summarize here. Don't take a banjo to learn in the Antarctic winter. It's not a tool of international diplomacy. Can we, will we, should we? For God's sake, look after our people and our planet. That was Robert Falcon Scott. But really, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Sir Alfred Tennyson, Ulysses. There it was, you know. And I think the greatest tragedy to mankind will be not to. not to try. Always, always, always smile. You never know how it will change yourself, others, and lead to different things. So who'd like to go to Antarctica now for a winter? I should sell these holidays. Taken all in all, no one has a worse time on the planet than an emperor penguin. Thanks very much.